Welcome to Season 2 of Insurgency Unmasked. Join us as we explore the hidden stories and complexities of the Ukrainian conflict, and listen in as we deconstruct the war in Ukraine step by step, expert by expert. So, welcome to another episode of Insurgency Unmasked with the modern insurgent. Today, we're joined by Bianca Bridger. How are you, Bianca?
I am good. How are you, Joey?
Fantastic. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
So today we're going to be breaking down the wonderful and chaotic world of the Wagner PMC group and the ever-evolving story that is the article you've been writing on them for us.
Yeah, man. They are an interesting group. Very hectic, very hard to keep track of what they're doing and where they are. But yeah, it's simmered down a little bit in recent weeks. So
quite dramatically and suddenly.
yeah. And what I find super, super interesting is, there was this big thing. It's like, yep, Prigozhin's dead. Then it's like, who did it? Everyone kind of knows who did it, but it's never going to come out likely. And everyone's just accepted it. Everyone's like, oh yeah, like he's just dead. We're not going to delve too far into it. But I find that like so crazy. And Putin didn't even go to his memorial, which is just like mad shade. But super interesting.
So to kick off, how did you start becoming a writer? Where was this desire?
Actually, it started way back when I think I've always been interested in like kind of more worldly topics. I guess obviously I grew up in New Zealand, and we're very isolated from everything basically. And my parents were homicide detectives in South Africa, and our dinner table conversations were always interesting. They would always be like, "Do you know what's happening in Sierra Leone?" Da, 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 like telling us all these crazy things. And I just found it interesting as a kid. And I studied political science at university. In my second year, I got an internship for Polyscope. It was like this political reporting thing that was based out of Columbia University in the US. And it was just like, I think two college guys who had started this wee like Instagram news company. And I was just posting for them. And I really enjoyed it. It was so fun. I learned a lot. And then, yeah, I just continued on my little journey, linked up with Modern Insurgent, and here I am.
Wonderful little journey.
Yeah.
And then Wagner, how did you first hear about them?
I think I actually saw their names, or like the name Wagner, floating around on Telegram channels back when I don't think I was writing for Modern Insurgent yet, but I did, yeah, see their names, and I always used to be like, what is that? Who are they? And it was only when I really got to Modern Insurgent, and obviously I got more interested in insurgent groups, that I was, yeah, quite interested in how they operate, what they do, why they do what they do. And it's crazy, like the amount of information behind it. And it's so tangled as well. Like there's obviously always going to be conflicting narratives. And that's what I think is the most interesting thing. There's never one, obviously there's some true facts, but everything else is up for a little bit of debate, which is always quite nice.
And I think the PMC world in general is chaotic enough. And then when you add kind of the Russian tomfoolery that comes with Wagner, it just takes it to another level.
Yeah, exactly. It's super crazy. Like, I didn't know much about PMCs or PSCs before I started looking into Wagner and stuff, but I did, which is also quite interesting. The model of Wagner is based off the model of executive outcomes, which was a South African like private military company, quite like up and about back in the day. And it makes a lot of sense in hindsight now that the models are similar, because in 2010, I'm pretty sure, Eben Barlow, I'm pretty sure is the name, the founder of Executive Outcomes, was invited to the St. Petersburg Forum to speak to the general staff members of Russia about private military companies. So it makes a lot of sense, although Wagner was only founded in like 2014, like a couple of years later. It still makes a lot of sense, just like what their operational objectives are and how executive outcomes and Wagner, they were executive outcomes is like there's a holding company that also deals with mining companies that are kind of like off branches of it. So it's not just like we are a military company and we only focus on shooting people. There's like a whole entangled web of like different branches, different things they do, like different specialists. It's really complex, which is a feat in itself, to be honest.
A whole lot of shadowy shit.
Yeah, exactly. It is. There's so much behind the scenes that I feel like people will never, either it'll never come out or it'll be one of those things that comes out like 50 years later and then no one cares about it. Which always sucks, but I guess it adds to the allure of like why people find private military companies so interesting. It's like they really are like a different species compared to the rest of the world. They can kind of do what they want.
Even like Western ones, they'll commit some of the most heinous war crimes you can imagine and just change the name of the company and just go back to doing it again and again and again.
Exactly. Blackwater, I'm pretty sure, is now Academy. But that's also the interesting thing. Obviously, if you look at like geopolitics and like the narrative between like East and West, and that's why Wagner is so, I don't know, why they can insert themselves or why they could insert themselves so strongly into Africa, because they play on that narrative that why do you allow the West to do this? Like, we're your friend. We're trying to help your government get away from the claws of the West. But it has some truth to it. Like, these Western nations will go and demonize other countries for the actions they're doing in active conflict zones, or they'll demonize, like, you know, the methods used in like tackling an insurgency. But when you look at their own actions, they're very quick to be like, no, we stick to international law. You know, we're the good guys. It's kind of ridiculous, but I mean, that's politics for you. But no, it's always interesting.
Literally just France in West Africa right now.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Like, I see a lot of people being like, why would they, you know, try and kick France out of it? And it's like, well, why is France in there in the first place? They always try and dance around that subject. It's like, why are they there? But you know,
always comes back to resources.
Exactly. But Wagner's exactly the same. Like Wagner, that's their kind of business model for Africa, is to like extract the resources of those nations and in turn provide security. But as a result of that, although their main goal is to extract these resources, sometimes like in Mozambique and like in Mali, they're hired to like do counterinsurgency operations against jihadists and stuff. And on the side, they'll be brutally attack the civilian populations of those countries, which, although I'm not saying, you know, like neocolonialism is good, it's not like the French government forces in those countries are going to be doing the same thing. So yeah, it's a tricky one. And I think that is like the tightrope most West African nations are walking at the moment. It's like neocolonialism, you know, PMCs. It's a tricky one, especially when you've got a lot of things that other countries want.
And especially when you've got then your own insurgencies in your country as well. It's a big,
exactly.
tricky one. So, Wagner, how did it start? Let's go right to the beginning.
Okay, right to the beginning. During the Iraq War, there was this kind of like a Russian security company called Anti-Terror Oral, which was basically assigned, or Russian companies who were operating in Iraq asked this company, Anti-Terror Oral, to kind of guard their assets during the war. And then they were also protecting like port facilities. They were, doing a whole bunch of stuff for Russian businesses in Iraq. And then from this, there was the Moran Security Group, which was tasked by the Bashar al-Assad government in Syria to fight against the Islamic State, and to, you know, do their thing over there. And that was pretty successful. They, you know, people hear a lot of things about like Wagner's activities in Syria. So Moran Security Group is fighting against the Islamic State in Syria. And then after the Syrian contract, Moran Security Group goes to Hong Kong and they create this company called the Slavonic Corps. And the Slavonic Corps is fighting in Syria. And this is a super unfortunate thing and kind of why. So the Slavonic Corps is like Kurdish forces in Deir al-Zor, at the Konoko gas plant. And because they were US-backed forces, heaps of US airstrike just basically wiped out that entire unit. And so they went back to Russia and basically in a bit of disgrace, and the Slavonic Corps was dissolved. And then in 2014, Dmitry Utkin, who was a part of the Slavonic Corps unit, obviously with everything going on in eastern Ukraine and like Donetsk and Luhansk, there was, partisan behavior there. They move in and he creates Wagner Group. And the interesting thing about Wagner coming in like that time, if you look at how Wagner is used today in the current war in Ukraine, it's completely different to how they began when they first entered eastern Ukraine. They were kind of used as a smokescreen for more like Russian security forces. They were like moving in slowly, doing their work, doing reconnaissance, trying to move in forces. And Wagner Group was basically just like their smokescreen, because they couldn't be like, this is a member of the Russian armed forces. They would like, this is some person who is somehow related to Russia. We don't know what they're doing there. And yeah, so in Donetsk and Luhansk, they also took part in like a fair few big like attacks during 2014, 2015, like Debaltsev and Luhansk airport. They also took out like a Ukraine military aircraft. So they were pretty like at that time already, even though they were kind of like still a seed PMC, they were pretty heavily armed.
So how did the Wagner group get involved in Ukraine specifically then?
Okay, so this is during all that like the eastern Ukraine, like Luhansk, Donetsk kind of separatist movements. They first started off, like I said, with reconnaissance. So they basically a few like 1,500. This is like all speculative. Obviously, this could never really be proven, but this is what the SBU says. They reckon like 1,500 Wagner people moved in and were just basically spying on the general populace and trying to find ways that they could further infiltrate like Donetsk and Luhansk, right? And then obviously when that conflict, the separatist conflict, started heating up, they then jumped into like actual combat assaults. And they reckon like 60 or 70 Wagner troops were, deployed in eastern Ukraine at this time. Like I said, they shot down like a Ukrainian military aircraft around Luhansk airport. And what is really interesting is, so the Luhansk Republic, which obviously became a republic later after the elections, still never what's the word for it, like gave credit for that aircraft being shot down to Wagner. They were like, no, it was our separatist people that did it. And that's still a problem that obviously with the current war in Ukraine that we see now is, Wagner would make a big assault, make a big gain, and the Russian military would be like, this is the Russian military. And this was obviously the reason why Prigozhin and like the Russian military elites fought a lot, because they felt as though, their rewards were not being given to them. But then another interesting thing, this is still like early on in the separatist kind of conflict in eastern Ukraine, they then around like 2015 they became like the hitman of Russia. So obviously the separatist conflict had kind of gone on, and Russia had moved in their type of people to like make their kind of like little satellite republics, and Wagner is like credited to be the people who started taking out like a bunch of people in like the Donetsk Republic and the Luhansk Republic, taking out like low-level government leaders in those like sham republics, because they were becoming too like ideologically different from the kind of vision that Moscow had for those regions. So they were kind of like the hitman at that time and just like took out a bunch of people. I don't know, so there was the Alexander Bedanov, his nickname was Batman. He died. He was taken out along with 6 other people in 2015, because these type of leaders were real into that like Novorussia kind of political ideology, and that like Moscow Spring kind of, uppity, we're doing a little bit of a different foreign policy kind of vibe. Putin didn't like that, so they died. Another one got blown up in a car bomb. It was the Cossack regiment commander. His name was Pavel Dremov. Also 2015. And this is all attributed to Wagner. Obviously, it's never probably been proven, but I believe it. But yeah, and then obviously with the 2022 war in Ukraine, it's interesting, or at least to me, I find it quite interesting, is Russia didn't have enough boots on the ground because they obviously thought that, they'd take Kiev in such a short span of time. And so they had to kind of revert to Wagner Group because they couldn't like mass mobilize at that time. They had to move in people who, were pretty mobile in the first place and were keen, like quite used to going into like active war zones quite quickly and stuff. But they obviously didn't take into account, that Ukrainian nationalist like kind of spirit. And it is in my opinion that Wagner got a little bit stuck in the quagmire in the same space that the Russian military did. They weren't actually meant to be in there as long as they were, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's a good piece of analysis, to be honest. They definitely ended up having the exact same issues in the end.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's another big reason why obviously everything has played out how it has, because when Wagner was first in there, they were highly trained, they had a lot of specialties, and then as the war kind of grinded on, Russia needed more manpower. They allowed Wagner to recruit out of prisons, and then this is where like that famous like human wave assaults kind of strategy comes from, where it's basically they take these Russian recruits, even more highly trained Wagner recruits, and they basically send wave after wave of infantry units to try and like overwhelm a Ukrainian position. But because Wagner has such like a strict internal like disciplinary structure, if someone is wounded, if someone, if something's not really working in the assault, they will still continue sending wave after wave of people. It's kind of like in World War One, where they blow the whistle and like people are just going off the top and they're getting mowed down. They just don't care. But that's also why Wagner is like so different to, a normal kind of like military unit. Is normally if you're getting mowed down, you're going to stop, you're going to help your friends. You're going to tend to the wounded. But in a few cases, I think in a few like journalist articles I've read, that it is in their internal disciplinary structure that if you do stop the assault to help a wounded, you yourself can be shot on sight or like tortured afterwards. So that keeps a lot of people, Wagner members, in, I guess, almost a sort of fear from straying from the norm, because you need to be told by a higher up commander that the assault has ended before you can, do anything else, which is crazy. It is a hectic way to live.
I can imagine it's anxiety inducing in
Oh
more
God,
ways
yeah,
than one.
exactly. And I think that's why it does take a certain type of person in the first place to join like a private military company. And so obviously that's why, especially the old private military companies like Executive Outcomes, Wagner in the beginning, were so like revered, because they were highly trained people. They went in there, they like fuck shit up. I don't know if I can say that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can
But
swear on here.
they did their thing. They did their thing. And then they left. But obviously with the war in Ukraine now, it's such a quagmire that they had to go then recruit from prisons. Obviously the quality of the men goes down. The kind of camaraderie that you would have in like a smaller, tight-knit group gets like worn down. And then the whole thing starts to crumble, as we've seen in recent weeks. But also there's a whole different range of factors, outside external factors, which also influence it. But obviously you need those base levels, foundations to be strong, which were very much degraded throughout this war.
And I know we've touched on it slightly already, but how or what kind of things can a PMC like Wagner do on the ground in a conflict that your traditional state actor can't?
Okay, so what's really interesting about this, and why private mercenary groups are so useful in certain situations, is out of 191 member states of the UN, only 46 countries have signed this thing called the UN Mercenary Convention, and it's like obviously the Geneva Convention touches on mercenarism. Um, But basically, when you are a mercenary, you are not seen as an actual combatant in war. You don't have prisoner of war like perks. So say you're a mercenary and you're fighting in whatever, and you know the other people catch you, they're just going to shoot you because you're not as an actual combatant under like international, especially for the civilians of the countries in which Wagner are operating, is they are basically not subject to any law. And like if you actually look at it, because their home country, obviously that's how they kind of smoke screened it at the start. They weren't really connected to Russia, but they somehow they can kind of hide behind that. But no border. Here's a good example. Like, border goes out somewhere super publicly and does something super, super messed up that cannot be denied by the United States. It's like gone too much over social media. The United States, because they, champion themselves as the protector of democracy, yada, 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 they will be forced to do something. And obviously they probably won't go to jail, but they'd have to do something in some form of discipline to those members who were like seen by the world doing something bad. But obviously Russia and Wagner, it's a whole different ball game. These people really aren't subject to any laws aside from their like internal hierarchical disciplinary system. And, kind of the wishes of the elites. But it's a very interesting way in which they operate, and that's why I think it's so difficult as well for other countries. I think the US has recently I think the Department of Treasury put sanctions on Wagner, but obviously what is that really going to do in the grand scheme of things?
The Modern Insurgent is completely independent. If you want to support our work and help boost independent journalism, please consider supporting us via Patreon at patreon.com/moderninsurgent. Thank you very much.
So, what are some of the challenges that journalists and researchers like yourself face when trying to uncover the activities of Wagner in Ukraine?
I think mainly this is also like not even just in Ukraine, but in general with Wagner, because they're so they were so hidden and so intensely intertwined with like the Russian state security forces, that I think in total now there's like 17 journalists and media workers that have died in Ukraine. And that's not saying like Wagner's killed them all, but just it's an active war zone, right? It's a dangerous place to go and try and uncover stuff. And a lot of times if you go, I think as a journalist or a media worker, if you're going into Ukraine and say you're going into an area that was occupied and is no longer occupied, is actually having to try and find like a civilian or someone who wants to talk to you and is willing to, even though whatever they've gone through is extremely traumatic, right? And there is that fear of reprisal. Even say we don't know if it's an unfounded fear, but Wagner's occupied your city or your village for like a month. You've seen the kind of brutality that they do. That Wagner's been implicated in the Bucha massacre that occurred at like the start of the war. I think it was like 49 people, 49 bodies were found, hands tied behind their backs, like signs of torture. I think that's a really big blockage in reaching people who are willing to kind of step up and talk about either what they've experienced or what they've seen. And even Wagner in general, in like 2018, 3 journalists were killed in the Central African Republic for trying to report on, I think they were trying to record the Lobai mining area there, and they were killed in their car. They said like random assailants came and like shot them, took all of their equipment. The only person kept alive was the driver, who wasn't a journalist, which kind of points to something. And then again, like last week, I'm pretty sure, a journalist for Al Jazeera got beaten up by a Russian national in St. Petersburg for trying to report outside of the Wagner headquarters in St. Petersburg. And then again in 2008, someone trying to report on Wagner Syria he was a journalist, pushed out of, I think, his 5th floor like window on a 5th floor apartment building. So it's a hectic one. And I think in April of this year, a Wall Street Journal journalist who was not reporting on Wagner specifically, but he was in Russia. He was trying to look at a tank manufacturing company and speak to civilians who were living around there. Also spoke to a different Russian military blogger, was kind of pushing the boundaries, kind of mentioning Wagner. He was detained and charged with, I think, being a mercenary or something. And it's quite interesting because I know we've had Aidan Aslin on Modern Insurgent as well. He was charged, well, he tried to be charged by Russia for being a mercenary, and that also brings up the problem with kind of this uneven application of what a mercenary is in international law and how it can, be used for political ends, which is quite interesting. But I think, even though we report on them now, they still are, a very brutal mercenary group. You do have to be careful trying to, take out all their dirty laundry, because you don't know what they could do.
We kind of touched on it a little bit there. How has the international community responded to Wagner? Is it different to how we respond to other PMCs around the world?
I think it is quite different. I mean, we touched on Blackwater, and there's a few. I forget their names, but Wagner is the most popular Russian private military company, but there are other ones floating around as well.
Shoigu's got his own, doesn't he?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the problem, I don't want to say the problem with society in general, but the problem with the international community is obviously no one's immune to propaganda. Everyone, can be victim to a kind of shock factor, right? So if someone keeps waving something in front of your face, you're going to be drawn to that thing. And I think exactly that's what's kind of happened with Wagner. Obviously, they've done terrible things, and that's indisputable. But there's heaps of other private military companies that we probably don't even know about yet that are doing exactly the same thing. They've just been better on the PR front. Look at Blackwater. They've made a comeback after everything they've done in the past, and the US kind of waves them around and say, oh, we're reformed. And it's who makes the laws can also make sure that they're not charged by the law. And that's obviously, everyone knows the problem with the UN. It's so ineffective. I think there was I think it was 2019 or even 2020, the UN tried to make an investigation into Wagner's or Russian forces human rights abuses in the Central African Republic, and Russia just barred that. They vetoed it at the UN. So that it shows how, it's just basically, it's a null and void kind of institution, and it really needs to be reformed. But that's another bag of worms.
I think we could do an entire season on the failures of the UN.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, Wagner's a huge marker of that. Also, the failure to respect borders. But it's jihadists aren't respecting borders. Wagner's not respecting borders. But if a country who does have a fighting force, who is, trying to do something for the best interests of the country that Wagner's in, it makes it tricky. Obviously, a lot of Africa does not trust these Western countries anymore. That's something that's been super, super clear in the past few months. So going forward, obviously, we don't know what the future of Wagner is in Africa, or, they're not really in Ukraine anymore. But however, the future, when it comes, and what the kind of next moves is for Wagner there, it'll be interesting to see how the international community tries to tackle it, especially it's front page news. So, you got to ride that PR wave, I guess. Try spur on some action.
I can imagine it's a situation that will get worse before it gets better.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And that's something that I think is also quite interesting into looking at Russian domestic politics. It's almost similar to how the Third Reich, you had your German kind of police force, which still operated. If you're a German civilian and you did something wrong, you'd still go through the normal criminal justice system. But it was very difficult to resolve elite disputes in the Third Reich, and there was a lot of killings. They went to Hitler, and they're like, oh, what do we do? That's very similar to what happens in Russia today, and that's also something that having Russia goes in and show you is, say you're in Russia, you're a normal Russian citizen, you commit a crime, you drunk drive, whatever, you're going to go through the normal Russian justice system, however that may be. But when you're an elite, it makes it very difficult to, kind of resolve any kind of dispute you have with someone in the military apparatus, someone in like some other governmental apparatus, because you're all kind of vying for the support of Putin or the support of your finances. And that's also why what's going to come in the future with Wagner is going to be so complex, because it obviously was a huge turning point and showing, you know, someone who Putin really thought was his like bro, I guess, if I can use that word. Yeah, you know, things can wind up completely differently. And I think obviously there's a lot of analysts who's looked at it and been like, this just shows like, you know, support for Putin and support for the internal network of the Kremlin is crumbling. I don't think that's exactly true. I just think it's the result in a huge fighting down on, you know, who Putin keeps around and how he then chooses to carry out his foreign policy in other countries. I think would be like a very shocking thing in a way, and you'd you know, tighten down the hatches and try and keep who you think you trust closest to you.
I think it's a great comparison. It makes it a lot easier when your state is built on corruption to just not have trials of important people, because it can just bring the whole system down. Easier to throw out a window.
Yeah, exactly. And that's I think also in itself, obviously it's a negative thing, because that breeds so much distrust among elites who are meant to be working together, because obviously you can have somewhat like a functioning corporation. There's some level of distrust, but if the distrust is so strong that like you're going to work every day thinking, oh my god, if I mess up I might get shot out of the sky with a missile while I'm trying to fly to somewhere, I think, you know, you could start reevaluating who you're keeping around in your circles, what your future career might look like. You know, it's a tricky one.
Yeah. I think it's with the whole plane situation. I know we'll go into it again like more in a minute. I wouldn't risk getting on something that high up over Russia if I was him. I think it's absolutely insane. OPSEC.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm on for their own death, but I think the case of Prigozhin, it was, I think he felt as though he had some authority out of himself. And like thus far, even with his like online little spats with Shogu and other military elites, he hadn't really faced any kind of consequences. And I think everyone thought after they tried to march on Moscow that, you know, he'd just be killed on the spot. Obviously, everyone's seen Wagner disciplinary tactics. Everyone thought like he'd be in some bunker getting like tortured or something. And then for him to show face in Africa, I think that was a really shocking thing for the world and journalists and analysts. But I think, I mean, like, the way Putin kind of dealt with it, there was something hectic, and I think it definitely sent a message. And it will keep, you know, the boys in line for the near future.
Yeah, I can't imagine anyone else is going to step out too quickly.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's crazy.
So let's wind back a little bit. We touched on the Bucha massacres already. What are some of the other notable incidents that Wagner have been involved in so far of the invasion?
Okay, yeah, Bucha massacre. That was, I think the Bucha massacre was something that really was something shocking towards the start of the war. Obviously, you know, it is an active war zone, but I think the general population, or people who like civilians who follow this conflict, I think, you know, after the atrocities of World War II, they generally think, especially in like a theater like Europe, that people are going to stick to rules of engagement. And I think it was so shocking. I think it was German intelligence who uncovered this. But it wasn't, obviously it's still bad if anyone dies through torture, but it wasn't just adults, there were kids as well. I think, yeah, 419 active people actually, you know, showing signs of torture, rape. That's something that is really common in Wagner's tactics in Africa, but I think the most shocking thing, obviously, for the average European is going, this is happening in, you know, Europe's backyard. I think it's not something that people have been used to, especially in like kind of this era. I'm not counting the 90s. But yeah, I think, yeah, it was something quite shocking. And obviously they also took Bakhmut and Soledar. Again, that's another thing that leads into kind of disputes with the Russian military elite, because Wagner claimed that Wagner took those cities, and then again, Russian armed forces said, no, we took the cities. And I think that's something also that kind of stood on that fire of not feeling as though you're being rewarded for the effort you're putting into such an assault, or victories you're trying to do. You're somewhat fighting for the same goal. And I think that's something that Prigozhin felt as though like he was not getting properly rewarded for the work he was doing, which also came out after his ammunition stores started drying up. But no, it's very interesting, and I think I mentioned this earlier. I may have not, but Wagner's internal discipline structure as well. Not just events in the war, like gains made in the war, but kind of things that we've seen come out of that war, such as that sledgehammer kind of discipline. I'm pretty sure what happened was a video got released on Telegram, on a Wagner affiliated Telegram channel, and they said that this was Wagner he tried to desert the Ukraine or tried to leave the fighting, and they basically duct taped his head to a brick and smashed it with a sledgehammer. And also that's something obviously to instill fear in other Wagner members, but also to just kind of prop up the kind of notoriety that Wagner has on the international stage, which again is like a PR thing. Wagner's very good at the propaganda, but no, it's a hectic thing that they do. I watched it with like my eyes behind my fingers, and I was like, I really don't do gore or anything like that, especially when it's so torture, any of that. I know that's like actually a really normal thing to be kind of put off by, but it's not for me. And it's definitely, I mean, it does send a message, and I think we've seen obviously in recent months Wagner, the Russian military, they're fond of sending messages, but it also adds to that notoriety. But then again, like even after that video, it's not like the international community was going to do anything, because they were doing something to their own member. But then you get reports coming out of Africa, and they're doing this to civilians, and there's still no really any international move to do something.
That leads me perfectly to my next question. When you compare Wagner in Ukraine to Wagner in Africa, are they two sides of the same coin, or are they two distinct things?
I think they're quite distinct. And as I said earlier, Wagner in Ukraine, they were not thinking that they would be there for long. They had their groups, they were highly trained. They thought it would kind of be one and done thing. They'd capture all these cities and be easy going, and then they could go back to Africa to where, they were more needed. With the kind of churning on in the war in Ukraine, that obviously they saw that one, they were lacking in manpower, and one, they didn't expect, I think obviously most of the world didn't expect that huge surge in like Ukrainian nationalist spirit, which obviously spurred on a lot of people to join the armies, and just basically it was harder to attack these cities or these villages, because the average populace was putting up defensive like fortifications. And I think in Ukraine, they really stick to those, as I mentioned, like human wave assaults, because I've got that disciplinary structure where if you try and desert, you're going to get shot. If you try and like walk away from assault, not just desert, but like try and capture, try to help a wounded friend, like a wounded Wagner officer, you're going to get shot anyway. But the thing about these human waves assault, which is quite smart on the Wagner end, is these assaults, it's normally infantrymen, it's normally those that they recruited from the prisons, like actually taking part in the assaults. But the main kind of crux of a unit, like the commander, any like the machinery operators or like business operators, they aren't used in the assault, so they can like carry on, they can jump from unit to unit. So the actual important crux of the unit stays and normally is kept alive, and kind of the expendable, the those that they send to the meat grinder, they don't really care. It's kind of like the same strategy Stalin had in World War II, like I can have 10 untrained Russians to it's basically the same thing. And that just leads to a bunch of losses. But again, the importance of Wagner in this war is because mercenary companies or like military companies aren't legal in Russia, all these deaths are not reported on Russian like armed forces. They're not counted as part of the Russian armed forces. So one thing that is good, Russia can kind of keep the domestic populace happy by showing them lower death counts and not doing a full Russian mobilization. And also, you know, sending these bunch of people to the meat grinder who sometimes are able to overrun Ukrainian positions, but only after like hundreds of losses. But in Africa, Wagner tends to be more highly trained. The units are smaller, they're more highly trained, and they have their objective is more outlined. Like obviously in Ukraine, everyone's kind of like, what is Russia actually up to? They're kind of just holding ground, they're going to grab something, then they lose it, then they grab it again. They've kind of got a bit of an iffy objective there. But yeah, in Africa, I definitely think that their objectives are more clear. They have more of a guideline of what their kind of rules or engagements are, because they've seen that they're not really going to get much slack for you know, attacking the civilian population. But also, like in Africa, they're effective sometimes and ineffective sometimes as well. In Mali and like Cabo Delgado, Wagner has really struggled to fight like Islamic insurgents. I think a lot of it comes down to not being willing to adapt to the new environment they're fighting in and not willing to cooperate with local forces either. Obviously in Mozambique and the Cabo Delgado, they put out just because they were getting their asses handed to them. Mali, there's so many instances of civilian like brutality on civilians in Mali, and the Malian government has actually blocked inquiries into any of these killings. And obviously in the Central African Republic, again, they've got a bunch of cases where they've attacked civilians. But no, it's their tactics, I think, are more set out. They have a more outlined structure of what they're actually doing in these African countries, because it's almost like a playbook. Like Russia has been kind of using these disinformation campaigns, propping up governments of these African countries for years since the Cold War. They kind of know what they're doing there. Obviously in Ukraine, it's a whole different ballpark. They're still, I think, you know, they're just in the meat.
Yeah. And the last two questions. So following on from kind of Wagner's withdrawal from key positions in Ukraine, through all the Belarus lark with Prigozhin there, to the infamous plane crash that we've mentioned. What's next for Wagner? Is it dead?
I think that's a good question, actually. I think obviously only the future can tell us, but I think a lot of people in the Russian, like in the Kremlin, they know that Wagner itself it's a phenomenon in itself. There's not many private military companies who have had such far a reach across the globe, who have accomplished as many things as they've done, have, you know, evaded any type of really international like criminal prosecution. And I think obviously I'm not going to say hopefully, I think people in the Kremlin, if they realize that itself, that phenomenon is something that is not common and is something important, obviously, to the Kremlin's foreign policy goals, they might work to try and salvage it. I think, obviously, some people might have read that before Prigozhin died, he found out that Russia was trying to incorporate Wagner into the Russian armed forces. I think that Russia would be silly to try and do that. I think adding, you know, these, if there's any left of them, highly trained Wagner mercenaries who have been in multiple theaters across the globe, have really specialized skills, to kind of just dissolve them into what we've seen as a somewhat ineffective fighting force, is going to lower their chances of kind of fulfilling any type of foreign policy goal that they have, especially in Africa. But you know, we'll just have to see what happens. I think especially it's important now to follow along what could happen in Africa. I mean, a lot of things are going on there at the moment, but to have Wagner completely disappear would obviously completely basically cut off an arm of Russian foreign policy force in the continent, which obviously would be a really good thing for those Western countries. But I think the Kremlin isn't that stupid, if I can say that. I think they kind of realize that it is a really important foreign policy tool. They might remake it in a new image, and they might, place people who Putin really does have on a leash, and try and reenact the same thing. But I think that's what made Wagner, was having this kind of like flamboyant pre-goes and having goes at people on the internet. So, whatever comes along after Wagner obviously isn't going to have the same pizzazz, but I think it'll be something similar, just on a tighter leash, for sure.
And then a similar question, but slightly broader. How do you foresee the future role of PMCs in conflicts? Is it going to boom?
I think it can take two routes. Either it'll boom, but I think the international community now is becoming aware of like the type of damage that these private military companies can wreak, and that's also something that's in Russia. Wagner itself was just a show that the Kremlin had lost its monopoly on violence in Russia itself and across the globe. And obviously with like autocratic dictatorial regimes, you don't want to lose that monopoly on violence. That's what really keeps you in power. So any smart government, I think, would try and rein them in. Or you've got maybe a more kind of out there government who sees that they can be really useful. But again, you have to keep them on a tight leash. I think in any future conflict, either heaps of countries will realize that they're quite useful, and instead of sending, the regular armed forces in, they'll just go, oh, we'll do PMC for PMC and have all these people fighting each other. Or they're going to see that it's crazy. They can lose power from it. They can obviously go rogue and try and march on the capital. So it all depends on what the state's own ideology is. What is the main objective of the leader of that country? Most likely, I think that they are going to want to rein in these PMCs. They can see the damage that they wreak, and obviously for Western countries, they're all about having a good image in the world. So I think having some PMC doing whack shit and having that directly connected to your country's name is not a good look. For anything, trying to have a bilateral agreement with someone while, you have some shady PMC of yours like operating in their back rooms. It's not easy.
Every year that goes by, I think we've privatized warfare as much as we can. Every year, I'm surprised.
It's intense. I think that's also something that, obviously being in this generation, I think we're still yet to see, but the absolute technological advances in warfare that we've made, the different theatres in warfare that we're seeing, and like the different tactics that I use, I think, in 50 years even, the type of war that is conducted is going to be so far out of the grasp of anyone who ever witnessed World War II. They're just going to think, obviously Ukraine's still like, it's kind of on a middle ground. They obviously use somewhat traditional tactics, but like drone warfare, it's something, building for something really crazy, and the like mass casualties that can be inflicted from the new types of weapons that we have, I think is something we really have to be careful with. It's been shown time and time again that, in a war setting, people really have no regard for human life. But I think, as we're seeing now with like even climate change disasters, human life can be taken so easily, and I think that's something that needs to be more kind of cherished in any kind of setting. It's crazy. That's also, sorry, can I just say another thing? Speaking on these technological advances, something that has really, like, something I've noticed and I don't enjoy it at all, as you see, especially Instagram pages, Telegram pages. The war in Ukraine has almost become a spectator sport. You can go on Instagram and watch a drone drop a bomb on a Russian foxhole, and the comments are all like, "Oh, Ukraine doesn't do that," and we get it. It is a war, but I think still that really there is a disconnect because of that technological advance. Because you can see it through your phone screen while you're sitting in a country where you're millions of miles away from this war. I think it's a very weird phenomenon, and I think people need to keep an eye on that because there is a cognitive disconnect there, and it is strange.
I've said it on multiple episodes of this podcast so far. It disgusts me how often I watch people die.
Yeah, 100%.
And like, without even looking for it, it's there. Like, easily. It's terrifying.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is definitely something that people aren't so much aware of. It is a type of desensitization. You know, you can go and Google Ukrainian war footage now, see someone get like blown out of the sky. And obviously, if you look at the comments, I think the comments are the most concerning thing. Where people vying both sides. Most of the time, both of the people making those comments are sitting on sides of the world that have never seen what an actual war is like. And it becomes a spectator sport. It's like gladiators, and I think it is quite disgusting. And it's definitely something, you know, the international community look, and obviously you can't stop the advances of technology, but I think the effect that it has on the human brain is not normal, and more people need to be aware of it.
And I think that's a brilliant place for us to finish. Fantastic. Yeah, it's been an honour to have you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you.
Is there anything you'd like to promote or anything like that? If not, no worries.
Yeah. Nah, not really.
Most of our writers have just kind of shouted out TMI, and I'm like, if people are listening to the podcast, they already know TMI. All right.
Exactly. But thanks for having me on, man.
The Modern Insurgent is your impartial, independent, and academic guide in deconstructing the world's conflicts and insurgencies through our unique documentaries, podcasts, reports, and scholarly articles, reporting on the underreported.